Anyway, we want to continue our introduction to the book of Galatians. And again, I don't want this to be, hopefully this is, maybe it's too much stuff that I put in here. I did try to go through this morning and edit out a few things. So I'm going to try to go as quickly as I can through some of this material, but I think it's, hopefully it's helpful in understanding the book and understanding where Paul is coming from and some of the things that he is discussing here. So anyway, y'all can stop me anytime, anything that we want to look at. Hey, Brother Scott. So welcome your comments on any of these things. All right. So we're looking, the pulpit commentary had one of the longest introductions to Galatians of any of the things I read, and some really good material. Like I said, I tried some last night and some this morning to edit down some of what I had. Still a lot of material here, but we'll try to read through it as quickly as I can, and hopefully, as I said, it'll be helpful to you. It says, Galatia was a tract of country lying on the northward part of that elevated tableland, which forms the central part of the great peninsula we call Asia Minor or Anatolia. On the south, these uplands rest upon the long range of the Taurian mountains, running more or less parallel with the coast. On the north, they are upreared first by the Olympus Range and then by the Aladag and Olgaz mountains. It says, anciently, these lands were to a considerable extent occupied by the Phrygians, then deemed, according to Homer, one of the finest races of mankind. That's what they said about the people that were located here. But in the earlier part of the 3rd century before Christ, hordes of Gauls, again, as we mentioned the other day, that's people from France. That was the old name for France. Had managed to cross the Hellespont and had poured themselves upon the western districts of Asia Minor, carrying havoc and rapine in every direction. At length, these wild tribes got bounded in within the limits of that country, to which they gave their own name, being a district which they had wrested from its former Phrygian occupants. In the year 189 BC, they were conquered by the Roman general Manlius Fulso. The Romans, however, found it advisable to allow them for a long time to remain to a considerable degree independent under princes of their own. One of these was Diotarus, a friend and useful ally to Cicero, then proconsul of Cilicia, who afterwards defended him when arraigned before Julius Caesar on the charge of attempting to assassinate him. This Diotarus first united the Galatians under one sovereign in 65 BC. On the death of a successor of his, Amyntas, 25 BC, Galatia, with the addition of some neighboring districts, was constituted into a Roman province under a governor. So they were under Roman rule for a while, but apparently had a lot of autonomy underneath Roman rule until right before the days that Christ was born. It says, it came to pass that the term Galatia is used in a wider and in a narrower sense. And that's where some of the debate comes in, which says the church of Galatia. Exactly who is he talking about? It says it sometimes designates the country properly so called. Sometimes the Roman province made up of this Galatia and other districts added thereto, which were different at different times. At the period we're now concerned with, these additional districts were Lycaonia, Assyria, and a portion of Pisidia, all lying to the southwest and south of Galatia proper. So it's interesting, they contradict themselves several times in some of these things. So Lycaonia, that would be Lystra, Derbe, Iconium, Antiochus, Pisidia. So here seems to be saying at this time they were part of Galatia, and then he's going to go on and say in a minute that they weren't part of Galatia. If the term is used by Paul denotes the country which was coextensive with the Roman provinces of that name, we might reckon the churches of Antiochus, Pisidia, as well as those of Iconium, Derbe, and Lystra, cities of Lycaonia, as among the churches of Galatia. This hypothesis, however, is shown by Bishop Lightfoot to be untenable. We're saying it appears that they were part of Galatia, and apparently they're not. It is a prevailing opinion of critics that the word Galatia is used by the apostle with reference to this country in its stricter and more proper sense. So they think that when Paul used the term Galatia, he's not including these places where he had been before. At this time, the Galatians were divided into 3 septs. The Trachmae, occupying the easternmost position, their capital being Tavium. Next came Ptosages, with the capital city Ankara or Angora, still the capital of Turkey today. It was famous in ancient times, as it is now, for the soft camlet fabrics woven from the fine hair of its goats. Westernmost were situated at Talastobii, with capital Pessinus, situated under Mount Dindamus, and was world famed as being the chief center of the worship of Cybele, the mother of the gods. It has been stated that the Gauls gave the district which they occupied their own name. Galate is the form under which the name, which in Latin is Gaul, commonly appears in Greek authors after the time of Herodotus, in whose histories it appears as Celt. The Galii of Europe were by the Greeks called Galatia. In fact, that Galatia now before us was a third Gaul, saying that this area was almost like another France, is what they were saying. Paul, writing at the close of his life, tells Timothy in 2 Timothy 4:10 that Christians was gone to Galatia. The word was commonly taken by Greek commentators as referring to a European Gaul, France, and not to that in Asia Minor. So sometimes even debate about whether it's talking about this or talking about France itself. It may be the case that Galate and Celt were diverging forms of the same word applied to different branches of the Celtic race. And we talk about the Celtic and French origins of some of the people that were situated here. It is interesting to observe that the Gauls in Bossumd in Asia Minor retained with Celtic tenacity their own original tongue to so great an extent that the language is declared by Jerome to be in his own time, which was more than 3 centuries later than Paul, very much the same as he had heard spoken by the Gauls at Troyes. Jerome, the exact dates of Jerome I don't remember, he translated the Latin Vulgate in AD 405, just to give you kind of a reference of when he lived. So over 3 centuries after the apostles is when he was working. It says they used, however, the Greek language as well, for which reason they were at times called by the Romans Gallo-Graecia. Indeed, the Greek tongue was in vogue all over the East. They were thus bilinguals, as was the case of many of the countries subject to the Roman Empire. It says compared John 19:20, and that's where you remember the sign that was put over the cross of Christ was written in 3 different languages. And so many of these individuals could speak many languages, not just one. Thus, when Paul and Barnabas were visiting the neighboring country of Lycaonia, they no doubt addressed the people in Greek, assured of being understood by them, while the Lycaonian populace, in their excitement, reverted quite naturally to their own more native speech. And it makes that statement when they performed the miracle of healing the lame man, they were speaking in their language when that occurred. The Galactic land. It is noticeable that Luke does not use the word Galatia at all. He twice finds occasion to specify the district. In both instances, he names it the Galactic land. So apparently in the Greek, when we read the King James Version, it does in both those places say Galatia. And some of the newer translations says the Galactic land is what he refers to here. No doubt he found this designation of it already in use and chose to employ it in preference to Galatia in order to make it more immediately obvious to the Roman readers to whom he was addressing his narrative that it was not the entire Roman province of the name that he was now referring to. So also then he used the term Phrygia in both cases in close connection with the Galactic land, there being no Roman province so called. He thus conjoins the two as being linked together by a certain measure of identity in their populations. At all events, the Galactic had originally formed a part of the country of the Phrygians. So saying, using the, kind of a more general term to describe that region when he mentions them. The Gaelic Invaders, again, those from Gaul that came into the area of Galatia around 280 or 272 BC. The Gaelic Invaders do not appear to have at once adopted the worship of Cybele at first. At all events, they appear subsequently to have embraced her worship most cordially. The fervid fanaticism of her rites would naturally present a great attraction to the temperament of a people so excitable as they were. It lingered long in this its old home. The Emperor Julian found it still subsisting there. Julian is after Constantine. Y'all are probably familiar with this to some degree, but Constantine is the one that kind of legalized Christianity and issued the Edict of Milan in AD 313, which officially recognized Christianity as a legal religion in Rome and gave it protection. Julian appears to be an emperor that came and briefly tried to take away some of those rights of Christianity. And so he did some things to try to prop up those old gods, those ancient gods, for a brief time. And that's who that individual is that they're talking about. The Galatians, however, served other gods as well. At Tavium, the principal object of worship was a colossal bronze statue of Zeus. At Ankara, there was a magnificent temple of Augustus in white marble, still subsisting in ruins. Their Lycaonian neighbors recognized Hermes, Mercury, as one of their divinities, as well as Zeus, Jupiter. And remember, that's who they thought that Paul and Barnabas were. When they healed this man, they tried to offer sacrifice to them, and they said it's Mercury and Jupiter that have come down in the flesh. It says both were adopted from the Phrygians, together with probably much, at least, of their other idolatrous worship. They had besides brought with them forms of religious or idolatrous observance of their own. This is from Adam Clark. It appears from the Acts of the Apostles that Paul visited this country more than once. 2 visits to this region are particularly marked in the Acts. The first about AD 53 in Acts 16:6, and the second about AD 56, Acts 18:23. And we read those verses with y'all a couple of weeks ago. Paul was probably the first who had preached the gospel in this region, as appears pretty evident from Galatians 1 and verse 6. And we see that in a number of places throughout the book of Galatians. It appears that Paul was the first one to preach to them in those regions. All right. Again, it mentions Peter's epistle, where he says to those of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia, and perhaps Peter also preached there, as we talked about before. It says that Peter thought at first that the gospel should be confined to the Jews is sufficiently evident from the Acts of the Apostles, but after his divine vision, which happened about AD 41, related to Acts 10, he saw that God had also called the Gentiles into the church. In his first epistle, which was written in AD 64, was probably 12 years posterior to that written by Paul to the Galatians. According to Clark, he thinks that Peter wrote 1 Peter about 12 years after the book of Galatians was written. And again, nobody knows for sure. Maybe more like 10, maybe less than that. These Galatians were doubtless converted by Paul, but after his departure from them, some teachers had got in among them who endeavored to persuade them, and successfully too, that they should be circumcised and keep the Mosaic law. And the apostle labors to bring them back from the errors of these false teachers. The rest of the epistle is of practical nature. All right, here's what B.W. Johnson says. It was on Paul's second great missionary tour, about AD 51, that he and company with Silas and Timothy passed from Lycaonia in Phrygia and Galatia and planted the seeds of the Christian faith. And we've read this before, Acts 16:6. Now, when they had gone through Phrygia and the regions of Galatia, and were bidden of the Holy Ghost to preach the word in Asia. So Galatia, and as you saw, one of the commentators said it's better to say the galactic land is a more accurate translation. On his third missionary journey, about AD 54-55, he went over all the country of Galatia and Phrygia in order, strengthening all the disciples. It says after he had spent some time there, he departed and went over all the country of Galatia and Phrygia in order, strengthening all the disciples. The gospel was received with great readiness, and the apostle himself welcomed as an angel of God, according to Galatians 4:14. A part of the converts were no doubt Jews, of whom, according to Josephus, there were many in Galatia, but the greater part were Gentiles. So we had Jews and Gentiles among the converts there. It appears that more Gentiles than Jews had been converted. All right, a couple more points from the pulpit commentary. Amongst these idolatrous nations there were scattered far and wide a large diffusion of Jews, forming in respect to the spread of the gospel a most important element of the population. Antiochus the Great, king of Syria, before he was compelled to give way in the year 191 BC, before the advancing power of Rome, held sway over a wide belt of country reaching from the shores of the Aegean right across the continent as far as beyond Babylon. We learn from Josephus that this king ordered his general Zeuxis to remove 2,000 Jewish families from Mesopotamia and Babylon into Lydia and Phrygia, and to locate them in the castles and places most convenient, at the same time securing to them the free exercise of their religion. If this scheme was fully carried out, it would infer the implantation in those countries of a population of not less than 10,000. Saying this could be one of the sources of a large Jewish population a couple of centuries before by Antiochus.
I was going to have a question about that. Where did all those Jews come from? Because They're down in Babylon, which is way down southeast of this area, and Jerusalem is almost due south and several hundred miles up to Galatia. So why did those Jews get there, or why did they go there? Is that the reason?
Apparently, that is part of the reason. You know, Brother Bill, I don't know if that's the only reason. You know, I've thought about that before. With think about particularly with the Assyrian Captivity. You know, that you taught us back in 722 BC, where you had the who was it, Tiglath-Pileser and Shalmaneser and some of those Assyrian kings that took them into captivity at that time. You know, and they never returned to Israel. Assyria fell, and so they had the right to move around. Did some of them later scatter to those areas or not? You know, I don't know. But it appears they were everywhere. You know, the Jewish people were everywhere. You know, it's kind of like in modern world history. We've read about that. You know, parts of Poland. Of course, we know some of that from Hitler and the things that he did. But there was a large Jewish population in Poland. There was a large Jewish population in Russia. And I think over the centuries and all that they had spread in some of those regions, you know. That's a good point. Good point. This may be the source of these particular Galatians.
Like wandering Jew. You know what wandering
yes.
Jew is? You just put something
yes.
and just goes everywhere.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Very well could be. Very well could be. Charlie?
Well, I read somewhere in the Bible, I can't remember where it was at, but it said Jesus Christ favored more for Israel than he did, I guess you call it Jordan, the Jewish nation.
Well, it's a good point, Charlie. He did say, some of y'all might know the chapter and verse, it escapes me now, but I want to say it was Matthew 15, where Jesus said, I was not sent but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. When he healed the woman's daughter had a demon. I think that was Matthew 15. But he says, I was not sent but to the lost house of the sheep of Israel. Or the lost sheep of the house of Israel, I should say. But he goes on, he does heal that woman, and I think he said some of that to show them how great her faith was. But you're right, during his earthly ministry, he did preach, he confined his ministry mainly to the Jews, although he did spend a lot of time in Samaria as well with the Samaritans. But it was always in the will of God to preach the gospel around the world. It's like in Genesis 12 and verse 3, I've always been struck with that statement. Prophecy of Christ says, through thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. That's in Genesis 12. So it was always in the mind of God to save everybody. His purpose of the Jewish nation, the way I see it, was, again, the nation to bring about Christ. But I think it was also a nation to try to preserve for the world some knowledge of the one true God. You know, I was doing some reading. I'd never had really thought about this a while back. Our world history book talked about this, but you think about even where he put his chosen people. You know, he put them in the land of Israel. So why is that significant? Well, where Israel is where three continents join together. You know, so Europe, Asia, and Africa all meet right there at that spot. So people going from Africa to Europe by land have to go through Israel. Or people going from Asia to Africa have to go through Israel. And so there'd be a lot of traffic between people going from one part of the world to another. That'd be kind of like a highway for some of these continents, which makes sense. You know, that I never ever thought about that, but that he didn't just in some random fashion put his people. He put them in a place where you would have people that would get some access or some knowledge of the one true God. And so it's a good point, Charlie. You're right. And even in the epistles, we read that Paul would go and speak to the Jews first and then to the Gentiles. Well, why was that? Well, the Jews were the ones that should have recognized Christ first, better than anybody else, because they had all those Old Testament prophecies. And yet often they were not the first to recognize who Christ was. But that's a good point. Good point. Other questions or comments on that? All right, great point. It says that Jews did abound in the Galactic region in particular is evidenced by another fact recorded by Josephus concerning a decree from Augustus Caesar, who reigned from 31 BC to AD 14. So he had died about 40 years before the book of Galatians was written, concerning the Jews in this region. Accordingly, we find in the history of the Acts abundant proofs of the great influence which the Jews were able to exercise in all these parts of Asia Minor, of whose evangelization Luke has given many details. The important influence of the Jewish population of those parts is further shown by the circumstance that in consideration thereof, Paul at Lystra or Iconium thought it advisable to circumcise Timothy to facilitate his evangelizing work. And it's interesting, I make a good point here. It's interesting, there's so many of these places that Paul preached, it talks about a large Jewish population. You know, and we saw this reading Acts 16 and Acts 14 the other day, and Acts 16, a large Jewish population in Antioch of Pisidia, and Iconium, Lystra, Derbe. Paul himself was from Tarsus of Cilicia. He was a Jew, but he was born and raised in Tarsus of Cilicia. We saw that in Berea, in Thessalonica, in Corinth, in Ephesus. In all these places, there were large Jewish populations in many of these regions. However they got there, that's a good question that Brother Bill raises. Again, that's one explanation, Antiochus there, but again, throughout the centuries, they had gotten there. This is interesting to me. Roman roads. The spreading abroad of the now commercial people of the Jews was favored by the accommodation which the Roman government provided for easier locomotion in the roads it built intersecting these countries of Asia Minor in all directions. And they are particularized in the itineraries. Some of them are still in existence. And today you can still see some of the Roman roads in some of these places that are still in existence. It indicates Roman engineering, how well built some of these roads were. It says these roads passed through Gordium, formerly the capital city of Phrygia, and still in those days an important center of traffic, lying on the northwestern frontier of Galatia, and went out by Tavium, another important center of commerce on the eastern side. It says these roads had no doubt much to do with the direction of the course which Paul took in his 3 great journeys in Asia Minor. I think that makes sense. Say, which ways did Paul go? Probably the roads that they had built. So we can kind of, pretty much kind of know what path he was likely to have followed to get to some place that he did. I think I mentioned y'all the other day, one of my favorite TV show that comes on now as far as modern stuff. I watch very little modern TV. We always watch old TV shows in our house. But the Oak Island that came on Tuesday nights. They had the season finale a week or so ago. It comes on Tuesday nights. But they were in Portugal examining some stuff. And there were some Roman roads that they took pictures of that were still in existence there in Portugal, built 2,000 years ago by the Romans. Here's a map I thought y'all might find interesting, showing the roads that were built throughout the Roman Empire. Again, very significant. You see a large concentration of roads, of course, in Rome, the capital city. A lot of roads coming into the capital city. But you can see even in areas of Spain and Portugal that just mentioned, some major roads that they built. In England, very substantial road system there. See parts of North Africa, all on the Mediterranean, they can get to here. In areas of Greece, in the area we're talking about here in modern Turkey, where Galatia was, you see a number of major roads that pass through those areas. And so, again, which way did Paul go? He could have gone a couple different ways. When it talks about him passing through the upper coast. Was that talking about on the map, or is that talking about elevation-wise? I'm not 100% sure. But there's various ways he could have gotten from Tarsus in Cilicia to places at the coast where he crossed to Philippi or later on in Ephesus. So a very extensive road system that the Romans built. I showed my students world history. I found a little documentary showing how the Romans would have gone about building these roads. It's incredible, the knowledge they had of engineering and keeping the road straight and all those sorts of things. It was amazing to see. There's another map of the same thing. I don't know if that's clearer to see or not, but again, a fascinating the Roman road system throughout their empire that you see there.
It's amazing how many roads are there and how difficult that would have been. How many hundreds of thousands of men required to build all these things.
Yes.
Well, just look at Great Britain all up there. This whole place is covered with roads.
That surprised me. I mean, I knew that the Romans had been up there, but I had no idea they had done that much work there in Great Britain. That was amazing.
Yeah, the near one constant with that is along nearly every coastline, there's a road that runs the entire coastline. That way, no matter where they landed,
yes,
they had a road to get on and go either direction.
Yes, that's right. Good point. Good point. Some great engineers. They certainly were. All right. the Jewish tincture or tint of this epistle. Attention has been drawn to the especially Jewish character, which in this epistle marks Paul's reasonings and style of illustration. However, the churchmen he is writing to had before their conversion been in bondage to gods, which were really no gods. Moreover, that they were Gentiles is clearly implied in Galatians 2:5, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you and is rendered certain by their not having been circumcised, but only solicited to receive circumcision. It says the method which the apostle uniformly pursued in his work of evangelizing the heathen, that is by addressing in each place the Jew first, as Charlie mentioned a moment ago, was both justified and recommended for his adoption by the consideration that Jewish converts might be expected to supply the most ready and most reliable instruments for the religious guidance in the newly formed churches. What he's saying is, we mentioned this a moment ago, the Jewish people are the ones that should have recognized Jesus the quickest, because they had access to these Old Testament scriptures and had seen the fulfillment of these. It should have been obvious to them who Jesus was. And yet, as Paul talked about in the book of Romans, they stumbled over the law. Again, the law was a stumbling block to them to come to the knowledge of Christ. It says the new economy was professedly based upon the old, being in fact its proper and its all-along designed development. Out of his already well-filled treasure, he could bring forth things old as well as new. The old things were familiar to his hand, that is the old scriptures, and when illuminated and more completely vitalized by combination with the new, were immediately available for the most effective enforcement of the doctrine of Christ. Many of the first elders of Galatia and other regions may have been Jewish. Talking about the Jews that were converted would have a good knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures and would be able to share that with others and explain that to the new Gentile converts. Again, when Paul alludes to scriptures here in Galatians, pretty much the Old Testament only scriptures they had. You had maybe a few of the New Testament books that are starting to be written, but you didn't have that completed yet. And so often the Old Testament scriptures are what they looked at. It says, further, we must bear in mind that the only scriptures which Sunday by Sunday furnish those sacred readings in the Christian assemblies were the same as those referred to by the apostle, the scriptures of the Old Testament. In these, their teachers searched for and found those truths relative to our Lord's personal history, which were embodied in the brief summary of Christian faith instilled into the mind of the church. The histories of the Old Testament is prophecies, and again, I don't know the exact number. Some of y'all may have. I've heard Brother Joel say over 300 prophecies of Christ that we read about in the Old Testament. Unbelievable. I think like 30 in the last 24 hours of his life that were fulfilled. Its devotional utterances, the precepts of the Mosaic law itself, is illustrative of spiritual principles where each successive Lord's Day presented to the view of the Christian brotherhood by men of originally Jewish culture, but adding to that culture the all-important elements of the truth of the gospel. Now, it is obvious that the methods of biblical comment and illustration would to a very great extent be the same as they had been familiar with previous to their conversion, from the Jewish schools and from the synagogue preaching. So saying the Jews that were converted would readily see the connections between the Old Testament prophecies of Christ and the fulfillment of that. So it is not meant that these readings of the Old Testament constituted the whole of the service on the Lord's Day. We are able, however, to form some notion of the nature of their services from glimpses afforded by the Acts and the epistles. We cannot doubt that the Lord's Supper was conducted at least every Sunday. That's interesting that they acknowledged that, admitted that the feast called Love, Agape, was held. Also that psalms and hymns and spiritual songs were sung or chanted. Moreover, those who had gifts of prophesying and of speaking in tongues had opportunity given them of employing their gifts for the good of their brethren, and prayers were offered up, which all could take part in or express sympathy with. Thus, the reading and expounding of the Old Testament scriptures by no means formed the whole or even perhaps the main part of the business of these fraternal assemblies. What they're saying here is, obviously the Old Testament was read, but that wasn't the only thing they did in the worship service. They had people that were teaching the New Testament by prophecy. They were given inspiration to be able to teach some of these things we can read in our New Testaments each Lord's Day to the congregation. It says, when the apostle wrote this letter of his to the Galatians, this instilling into the minds of the Gentile converts of Christian truths, clothed in the garb of Jewish thought, had been going on in some at least of the Galatian churches for not less than 5 or 6 years, by which time these disciples, with the quickness and vivacity of intelligence which then characterized the Gaelic temperament, must have imbibed so much of Jewish theologic thought, Christianized, as would qualify them readily to apprehend and assimilate any such trains of thought and reasoning as those which we find in this epistle, which is saying they were able to grasp what the Old Testament was saying. It says their case, that of the Galatians, was different from that of the Thessalonian believers when the apostle wrote his 2 letters to them. These last were not yet prepared to receive instruction couched in these forms, the Thessalonians, that is. Their conversion from heathenism was too recent, and accordingly, in those 2 epistles, we do not find it. Talking about these topics. But the Galatian converts stood in a different position, as did also the Roman Christians and the Corinthian, and those to whom was sent the epistle to the Ephesians. All these, though mainly Gentiles, were become by the time those letters were sent to them familiar with the scriptures of the Old Testament and could be addressed as being so. And we'll read in the book of Galatians a number of references of Paul to events in the Old Testament, saying that they would understand what he was talking about, those events that occurred. It says, in Galatia, there does not appear to have been any one city which Paul made his headquarters for evangelistic work in any such way as in Asia he made Ephesus his headquarters, or in Achaia, Corinth. The epistle is addressed to the churches of Galatia as if there were a number of such churches. In those days, each considerable town or village had its own church, presided over by presbyters of its own, that is, elders, and an organization independent of the others, autonomy. We read of the churches of Galatia, the churches of Macedonia, and the churches of Judea. At the same time, no city, however large its entire population, is spoken of as having more than one church. For example, there was only one church at Corinth, only one at Antioch in Syria, only one even in Jerusalem. Although in this last city, there were tens of thousands of believers. 3 centuries later, in the peninsula now called Asia Minor, or Anatolia, there were 400 churches in Asia Minor. A considerable number of these may be assumed to have been in Galatia during that time. Of the previous history of these churches in the apostolic age, so what were the churches like in Asia Minor during the days of the apostles? It says not much is known. The only particulars which we possess relative to the evangelization of this region are drawn from the epistle itself. In the 4th chapter, the apostle reminds his converts that his preaching the gospel to them at the former time was occasioned by bodily illness. Next, the apostle makes most grateful acknowledgement of the quite extraordinary enthusiasm, a personal attachment which the Galatian converts had toward him. He also alludes in Galatians 3, 2, and 5 to their receiving the Spirit and the Spirit being supplied to them, expressions which show that the apostle himself first brought the gospel to these new neighborhoods. Further, the form of expression in Galatians 4:13, the former time, implies that there had been another visit afterwards before the writing of the epistle. In the Acts, written probably 4 or 5 years later than this book that we're reading here, we find mention made by Luke of 2 visits paid by Paul to the Galactic land. The first took place in the early part of the second missionary journey, which the apostle made in company with Silas. Starting from Antioch, he first visited the churches already subsisting in Syria and Cilicia. Then, likely going through the Cilician gates, probably in the spring of AD 51, the 2 evangelists came to Derbe, Lystra, and Iconium. In this neighborhood, the apostle adopted Timothy into companionship with them in the work. They then went on their way through the cities, apparently those of Lycaonia and Pisidia, delivering unto them the decrees for to keep, which had been ordained by the apostles and the elders which were at Jerusalem. The lapse of some time seems indicated by the manner of expression in Acts 16:5. So the churches, apparently of these churches, were strengthened in the faith and increased in number daily. The sacred historian then adds, and they went through Phrygia and the Galactic land, having been forbidden of the Holy Ghost to speak the word in Asia, and came over against Mysia. That is all that Luke says about Galatia here. Hastening on, therefore, to that most especially interesting part of the introduction of the gospel into Europe, he abridges the brief statement just cited. We're saying that he didn't talk a lot about Galatia because that was not his purpose. He wanted to show the gospel being taken into Europe and into Corinth and spent more of the narrative on that. In Acts 18:22 and following, Luke proceeds to relate some particulars of the 3rd missionary journey. Timothy is with him, together with no doubt other associates in the holy enterprise. After saluting the church of Jerusalem, probably in the year AD 53 or 54, he went down to Antioch, and having spent some time there, he went forth going through in order the Galactic land in Phrygia, establishing all the disciples. Then the historian adds, Paul having passed through the upper country, that is the upland plateau in the northern part, of which the Galactic land and Phrygia were situated, came to Ephesus. In the reference which Luke here makes to the Galactic land, we observe that mentioning it as before in conjunction with Phrygia, he now reverses the order in which the two districts are named. Whereas in Acts 16, he says Phrygia and Galatia. Here he says Galatia and Phrygia. This suggests the impression that the apostle approached those countries by a different route from before, one which brought him into the Galactic first. This would be the case if he had ascended the plateau from its eastern or Cappadocian side. A few years later, there were believers in Cappadocia so numerous as to call for a special mention by Peter in the greeting of his first letters. He mentions Cappadocia in that introduction. After completing the visitation of the churches in the Galactic and Phrygia, he probably inspected also the stations of Christian work dotted over other portions of the upper country. For example, Lycaonia and Pisidia, before descending to the lowlands to reach Ephesus. And I can't imagine him not revisiting some of those places he had been in his first missionary journey. I think that he did. It says, now when we consider that this extended tour from Antioch to Ephesus by a circuitous route, involving also frequent detours as well as frequent stoppages necessary in the prosecution of his evangelistic work, means a journey of at least 1,000 miles. So think about it, Paul traveling at least 1,000 miles, for the most part probably on foot. The traveler, a man not of robust health, when subject to attacks of illness, we can hardly suppose but that the greater part of a year, at the very least, must have elapsed from the time of his leaving Jerusalem before he reached the capital of Asia. If so, then, supposing the visit to Jerusalem to have been AD 53 or 54, it was probably not till the spring of 57, perhaps not till the spring of 58, that the apostle left Ephesus for Macedonia. That's incredible to think of Paul traveling 1,000 miles on foot. I was reading a while back, there was a Civil War veteran that wound up settling in Baldwin County. A guy named Helton was his last name. And it said at the end of the Civil War, he traveled by foot from Virginia back to this area. It said it was like 850 or 900 miles that he went on foot to get back here after the Civil War. So, again, that's a long trip by foot. Charlie, you had a point.
Well, it talks about in 1 Samuel 27:10, where David made a road to Judea and two other places from the south.
Okay.
Fast didn't even make a road.
All right.
And
So
he did.
good point. All right. So David did some engineering, road engineering too. Good point. Any questions or comments on any of that? All right. All right.
Yeah, can we go back over that again?
You want to go back over again? I want to try to speed up a little bit. I know this is getting a little bit long. The design of the epistle is apparent, and the scope of the argument will be easily seen. This is Albert Barnes writing here. It is not improbable that some of his friends in the churches there had informed him of the state of things, and he immediately set about a remedy to the evils existing there. The argument is more Jewish than the letter to the Romans. It is more in the Jewish manner. It is designed to meet a Jew in his own way, and is therefore somewhat more difficult for all to follow. Whereas he made this statement, I cut out some of that. He felt like Galatians is a more difficult book to understand than Romans, which I thought was interesting. Still, it contains great and vital statements on the doctrines of salvation, and as such, demands the profound and careful attention of all who desire to be saved and who would know the way of acceptance with God. The first object was to show that he had received his commission as an apostle. He begins by kind of defending his apostleship, as he had done in other places. Directly from God. He had not received it at all from man. He had not even been instructed by the other apostles. He had not acknowledged their superiority. He had not even consulted them. He did not acknowledge, therefore, that the apostles at Jerusalem possessed any superior rank or authority. His commission, though he had not seen the Lord Jesus before he was crucified, he had nevertheless derived immediately from him. Again, that statement, I don't feel confident saying, I know that Paul didn't follow Jesus before Jesus' crucifixion. I don't feel comfortable saying that Paul never saw Jesus. And this is my own speculation. To me, I know at these feasts, they'd have thousands and thousands coming to Jerusalem on these feast days. But I could very easily picture Jesus and Paul running into each other at some point, or Paul actually seeing some of the teaching of Jesus. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he didn't, but I think that he could have. We know that Jesus never sinned, so we know that he would have been at the feast 3 times a year. He'd been in Jerusalem 3 times a year. which means at least 9 times in his mission, his earthly mission work, that Jesus would have been there, or if he was there 3.5 years, anywhere from 9 to 11 times, Jesus would have been in Jerusalem at these feasts. Know that Paul was a devout Jew. He's going to be there too. It's just hard for me to believe they didn't run into each other. Maybe they didn't.
Yeah, and his biggest persecutors, Paul started out being, you figure he would have probably been in the background listening to some of it.
I believe he was, Dallas. I may be wrong. I know that's speculation on my part. I think that may be, we see his hatred of Christ in Acts 7, 8, and the first part of 9, and might have developed from him listening to Jesus, thinking that this guy is a false teacher, you know. But that's my own opinion. I know I don't want to bind that, but it's hard for me to believe that Paul would not have seen Jesus at some point in his ministry.
I don't think it really ever tells us one way or the other, so I think and it doesn't really change anything.
Yeah.
So.
That's speculation. I do too much speculation. But
how do the two not run into one another when one's devout on one side and the other one's the thing he's after? Yes.
Yep. So for whatever that's worth. Let me see. The doctrine, therefore, which he had taught them, that the Mosaic laws were not binding and that there was no necessity of being circumcised, was a doctrine which had been derived directly from God. In proof of this, he goes into an extended statement of the manner in which he had been called and of the fact that he had not consulted with the apostles at Jerusalem, of the fact that they had approved his course, and of the fact that on one occasion he had actually been constrained to differ from Peter on a point in which he was manifestly wrong. We'll see that later on in Galatians 2. The second great object was to show the real nature and design of the law of Moses and to prove that the peculiar rites of the Mosaic ritual were not necessary to justification and salvation, that they who observed circumcision did in fact renounce the scripture method of justification, make the sacrifice of Christ of no value, and make slaves of themselves. This leads them into a consideration of the true nature of the doctrine of justification and of the way of salvation by Redeemer. And again, that was what Paul and the apostles were fighting in Acts 15, where the Judaizing teachers were saying, unless you're circumcised, you can't be saved. And so they were constantly fighting that battle during that time. Here's a brief comment from Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown regarding the purpose and the design, the style of this letter. Paul's purpose then in writing this epistle was to defend his apostolic authority, to counteract the evil influence of the Judaizers in Galatia, and to show that their doctrine destroyed the very essence of Christianity by lowering its spirituality to an outward ceremonial system, to give exhortation for the strengthening of Galatian believers in faith towards Christ and in the fruits of the Spirit. He had already face-to-face testified against the Judaizing teachers, and now that he has heard of the continued and increasing prevalence of the evil, he writes with his own hand, Galatians 6:11, a labor which he usually delegated to an amanuensis. For Brother Joel used that term before, the person that would write what was being dictated to him, this epistle to oppose it. The sketch he gives in it of his apostolic career confirms and expands the account in Acts and shows his independence of human authority. His protest against Peter in Galatians 2 disproves that apostle supremacy, that Peter was superior to the apostles, as the Catholic Church came to teach. It shows that Peter, save when specially inspired, was fallible like other men. He was capable of mistakes. The style combines the two extremes, sternness and tenderness, the characteristics of a man of strong emotions, and both alike well suited for acting on an impressible people such as the Galatians were. The beginning is abrupt, as was suited to the urgency of the question and the greatness of the danger. A tone of sadness, too, is apparent, such as might be expected in the letter of a warm-hearted teacher who has just learned that those whom he loved were forsaking his teachings for those of perverters of the truth, as well as giving ear to calumnies against himself. The pulpit commentary says this: the manner in which the epistle opens makes it clear that the apostle was under the impulse of strong emotion, excited by tidings from Galatia, which he had newly received. He had learnt to his grief and astonishment that they were giving heed to certain who would fain turn the doctrine of the gospel of Christ into its clean contrary. Who these seducers were, the apostle nowhere explicitly states. We read in Acts that the Judaizing trouble at Antioch had originated with certain men coming down from Judea. And in the epistle itself in Galatians 2, Paul refers to the coming to Antioch of certain from James. This has suggested to many that the fomenters of the movement in Galatia had also come from Jerusalem and from Judea. The existence of this shade of allusion is, however, purely hypothetical. We're saying you can't prove that they came from Judea to Galatia. The words in Galatians 5:10, he that troubleth you shall bear his judgment, whosoever he be, appear to hint a certain eminent supposition held by one or more of these mischievous teachers. One or more of the Galatian elders or deacons themselves may have committed the offense. This would match what we read in Acts 20:30, where the Ephesian elders are warned that from among their own selves should men arise, speaking perverse things. Possibly it may have been this very experience of his in respect to the Galatian elders which prompted that utterance of warning at Miletus. Most especially the apostles' words in Galatians 6:12 and 13 favor the belief that the trouble originated with certain who were themselves Galatians. They are spoken of as undergoing circumcision. They'd evidently not been circumcised until they engaged in this movement, which again would point to these being Gentiles. They only wished to save themselves from the risk of being persecuted through the instigation of Jewish neighbors, a description wholly inapplicable to persons coming from James or from Judea. So again, whether these Jews had come from Jerusalem or whether they were neighbors in Galatia really doesn't matter, is what he's saying. It's hard to prove either way. All right. The mischievous movement then appears to have originated with certain Gentile members of these churches. They were grasping certain selected prescriptions of the ceremonial law. Circumcision was indeed being seriously talked about, and the passage in Galatians 6:13 favors the belief that some had already made a beginning of submitting to the rite in their own persons, that is, being circumcised themselves. It is distinctly stated that Galatian churchmen were toying with the observance of days and months and seasons and years with a sort of ignorant but solemn earnestness, where some of the Jewish feast days that they were trying to bind on the church. One thing is clear, by some means or other, they were instilling the sentiment that faith in Christ needed to be supplemented by some degree of conformity to the ceremonial law given through Moses. Paul insists upon these two theses, that faith in Christ Jesus is ground on which any, whether Jews or Gentiles, are made sons of God, and that the ceremonial law was a purely provisional institution which has no longer any place at all in the relations between God and his people. It may be surmised that as Peter had done at Antioch, perhaps neither did these Galatian subverters of the gospel in words preach their strange gospel, but simply preached it by their actions, namely by themselves practicing and by encouraging others to practice certain Mosaic observances, by studiously vaunting and glorying in such practices, and by putting out of the pale of fraternal fellowship those who kept aloof from such Mosaicism. They perhaps did not directly disown Christ as their hope of acceptance, but they were turning elsewhere for comfort and joy. Such movements of thought and feeling are apt in general to be very catching with unweary and unstable souls. We should not wonder that it should have spread with great rapidity from church to church. All right. Appreciate y'all's good attention. We're going to try to wrap this introduction up next time and kind of hit the date a little bit, but then we want to get into Galatians 1. I do have a start on the text, and hopefully we can get on that Wednesday night. Charlie.